is Casey Zizekas, and you're listening to Mark and AJ on Sports Talk New York.
And welcome back to WLIE 540 AM Sports Talk New York. Casey was just a little mistaken there. It's Mark and Billy and Joe. No AJ this Sunday evening. But Casey couldn't have known that when he was on our show back then. But AJ will be back next week. Joining us now is a former reporter for the New York Daily News, where he worked from 2005 to 2011. While at the Daily News, his coverage of historic sites in the borough of Queens earned him a Friend of the Media Award from the Historic Districts Council. He is freelance for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. His work has also appeared in the Hockey News, Colorado Springs Gazette, Long Island Press, Montreal Gazette, Naples, Florida Daily News, the New York Amsterdam News, the San Luis Obispo Tribune, St. Louis Dispatch, Tampa Tribune, Queens Courier, Queens Ledger, and Yahoo Sports, to name just a few. He joins us tonight to talk about his book, Images of America, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum. It is a pleasure to welcome Nick Hirshon to Sports Talk New York. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, Mark, how are you guys doing?
We're doing great. Now, your book is part of the Images of America history book series that chronicles the history of small towns, downtowns across the country. Each title features more than 200 vintage images, capturing often forgotten bygone times, bringing to life people, places, events that define the community. Local authors transform dusty albums and artifacts into meaningful walks down memory lane. The popular series has expanded over time to preserve and celebrate additional worthy topics, including local landmarks, architectural and ethnic groups, and more. So when you wrote this book 4 years ago, little did you know how soon the Nassau Coliseum would meet its end. As we wind down the final few months of the old barn, how did this project come about for you?
Well, I grew up going to Nassau Coliseum. I grew up in Queens, actually, but my grandparents lived in Merrick, not that far away from Uniondale. So I'd always pass by Nassau Coliseum, and it always struck me as a place that just never got enough attention. It was always on the periphery of the New York sports scene. I thought the Islanders were always underdogs, at least the time that I was growing up in the 90s, and it was really the low point in the franchise's history. And I had a friend who wrote a book actually about Shea Stadium. I'm a Mets fan and an Islanders fan, so I figured he had already done that one. I would figure out how I could do something about the Coliseum. And there was interest with the publisher, so that's the thinking that I had at that point. There was also some of the rumblings starting about the Lighthouse Long Island project, where they were going to renovate the building. So I figured it would be something that was a worthwhile project.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum was built on an Air Force base on the Hempstead Plains. And if people think the Lighthouse Project was the first political battle the Coliseum was involved with, they're sadly mistaken. Can you walk us through the transition from Mitchell Field to the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum?
Sure. So the site where Nassau Coliseum is right now originally was Mitchell Field Air Force Base, as you said, and it was owned by the Department of Defense, so it was federal property. And then in 1961, they decided they're no longer going to be operating the base, and there was a real debate over what they were going to do, the future of that property. So at one point, the Federal Aviation Administration wanted to open an airport on that site, and that actually got a lot of resistance from local residents. They didn't want to deal with the plane noise. People who live near LaGuardia or Kennedy can understand. And there's also some dispute about how many jobs it would actually lead to in the area. So eventually they dropped their bid, and then Nassau County was able to use the property. And even then there was some debate about how it should be divvied up. So eventually they decided they were going to split some of it between what became Hofstra University and Nassau Community College. And then they wanted to have what was originally planned to be a 7-building complex, including the Coliseum as just one of those 7 buildings. There was also going to be a concert hall, a library, a sunken garden. It really looks very attractive, actually, if you look back at it now. But they only eventually had money just for the Coliseum. And that's how that got built.
It seems like you go out of your way in the book to refer to the building by its full name rather than the commonly used Nassau Coliseum. Was that intentional, and why?
Yes, I'm glad you noticed that. That is intentional. Of course, as any Islanders fan, I get used to calling it just Nassau Coliseum or just the Coliseum. But I think it's very important to understand the legacy of veterans. And when it's named Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, that has a lot of meaning, especially now when we look at the Barclays Center where they're going to be moving, and so many other arenas, sports venues that are named after corporate sponsors, and it kind of just doesn't have the same feel as when you name it after veterans and also, from a certain area. I think it's something that you have an affinity for that building because of it. It's sort of the same thing that happened with Shea Stadium and Citi Field. And that's why I thought if these people gave their lives for this country, people who are still serving, and then they deserve that honor. And amazingly, that building has kept that name all of these years, even as we've seen so many others give way to corporate sponsors.
It's interesting. While the official dedication of the building took place in May of 1972, its first event happened a month earlier. What was the first event ever held at Nassau Coliseum?
The first event was actually a New York Nets game. Before the Nets obviously were in Brooklyn, New Jersey, they were on Long Island. So the New York Nets played Pittsburgh, and it was kind of a hastily arranged event in February of 1972, where they didn't even have all of the seats installed. So there's a story about this one woman with a trio of children showing up, and she realized that the seats that they were ticketed for hadn't even been put in yet. But the Nets won the game, and a lot of the reports from that time were saying that most people weren't even watching the action, even though it was apparently an exciting game. And I think Rick Barry had 45 points or something like that. But most people were just walking around the Coliseum marveling at this building, because if you go back to that time, which people may not really think about too much, but this is before any sort of major sports entertainment venue on Long Island, and everybody on Long Island were just going to the city for events. So to actually have something like that in your backyard, and now we're going to have our own NHL team, and our own basketball team is going to play in a nice new arena, 16,000 seats. So there was a lot of excitement in the early days.
Yeah, we had Billy Paultz on a couple of weeks, and he talked about the move from the Island Garden to the Nassau Coliseum, and he actually scored the first basket in Nassau Coliseum history. Now, a prominent name in Mets history had a big hand in bringing the National Hockey League team to Long Island. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the role that William Shea played in getting Long Island an NHL franchise?
Sure. So this is actually probably a part of history with the Islanders that I didn't even know too much about. But when they decided to build Nassau Coliseum, they realized they would need two tenants. So they had the Nets that were on the verge of going from the ABA into the NBA, and that happened during their time at the Coliseum, but they also wanted to have a hockey team. So who else to get than Bill Shea, who had just recently gotten the National League to create another New York team, and the Mets playing at Shea Stadium. So they decided to get him involved, and he pressured the National Hockey League with the threat that they were going to create a World Hockey Association team, WHA. And at that time, it was a very real threat that they were going to challenge the NHL for supremacy. So once that came about, they assigned a WHA franchise initially to Nassau Coliseum. That got the NHL bigwigs very worried. So they said, we can get this to go away if we can just give them an NHL team. So they agreed to expand in 1972 to Long Island.
Now, given your age, you have not witnessed firsthand a tremendous amount of success inside that building as far as the Islanders go. Yet I get the sense that that building holds a nice sized part in your heart. What is it about the building that causes the emotional attachment for you?
I think it's something about buildings, and you read off some of my history as a reporter and very interested in historic sites, especially buildings that are overlooked. And that have some sense of history that people don't really recognize. And of course, with the Islanders, we know about the Stanley Cup dynasty in the early 80s, even though they probably don't get as much recognition as they should sometimes. But when you think about everything else that happened there, and going into the history, it was just very fun for me. You know, presidents who have visited and other sports teams that may not have lasted for a long time, but it just holds a prominent place for me, almost like any fan. You know, if you've had moments there, whether they're highs or lows, and even though the Islanders weren't great when I became a fan in the late 90s, there were still some memories that I have of, for example, Mariusz Tarkowski scoring a hat trick and getting 35 goals in a year on the last day, I think, of the 1999 season. So, you know, I was there for the base penalty shot in the 2002 playoffs. I was there for the 2013 playoffs versus the Penguins. Anybody who experienced those kinds of events, I think, would have an affinity for that building, how loud it can get, and just that euphoria when you're with all of these other Islanders fans. And there's something really special about it being on Long Island, and something very sad about them moving to Brooklyn.
You know, while the Islanders probably had the greatest team success in that building, one could argue that even though Pat Van Bossy, Trottier Smith are all in the Hall of Fame, none transformed their game like Long Island's own Dr. J did for the Nets. What intrigued you about some of the Nets stuff that you found?
Oh, well, with Dr. J, I mean, you have somebody who came from Long Island, from Roosevelt, and when he comes to the Coliseum, I mean, it's really like his arena. And I know they did a documentary a few years ago about Dr. J, and they went back with him to the Coliseum, and he was walking through, going down memory lane, and he, of course, revolutionized the game. I mean, doing things with dunks that no one had ever seen before. There's a great photo in the book of him with his jersey inside out, celebrating and taking a swig of champagne after they won one of their championships there. So when you go back at the history of great athletes who have played at the Coliseum, of course, we go back to Bossy and Nystrom and Smith and Gillies and all the guys who have their numbers retired. But, look at some of the people from the other sports, and at the top of that list, got to be Dr. J.
Music has been a huge part of that building, as well as other sports that played inside there: indoor soccer, indoor lacrosse,
indoor arena football.
What are some of the more interesting things that you came across, the non-hockey, non-basketball related?
Well, I didn't know about all the other teams that had played there. Like you said, there was a few different lacrosse teams, actually. There were the Long Island Tomahawks, which existed in the 70s. And then later on, the New York Saints, which came in the late 80s and into the 90s. Then also they had the New York Titans lacrosse team that split games between the Coliseum and the Garden. There were the Long Island Jaws, which was a roller hockey team that played there for a while. And just a lot of indoor soccer, of course, the New York Arrows. There was indoor tennis also, the New York Sets and New York Apples, and had Billie Jean King on the team. I thought that was probably one of the more interesting things to me, that Billie Jean King is playing indoor tennis at Nassau Coliseum, something you wouldn't really think about. But also the fact that in the early days, the Coliseum was really booked almost every single night. Lance Elder, who was the general manager of the Coliseum for many years, he wrote the foreword to the book. And he was actually my professor when I was a student at St. John's University. And he just tells these stories about being booked for something like 400 events a year. And they would have stuff in the afternoon sometimes in the arena, and then renovated for something at night. And just the demand was so high to get into that Long Island demographic, especially since there's so many wealthy people living on Long Island. It's a place where there's a lot of disposable income. So I think I was just surprised at how many different teams played there and how many of them did very well there.
It's interesting. Even though I am a Ranger fan, I did grow up on Long Island, and it does hold a part of my heart every time I go in that building and realizing that it's not going to be there soon. It's kind of sad. All of us have something, whether it be our first concert or maybe our first hockey game. A lot of people on Long Island will miss that building. So, Nick, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight, as well as the wonderful memories of the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum in your book. Where is the best place to get Images of America, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. You can get it through Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. It's in a lot of the Barnes & Nobles. If you go Garden City, plenty of places to get it. We have a Facebook page, too, facebook.com/Nassau Coliseum.
Excellent. Nicholas Hirshon, author of Images of America, Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, available online and in bookstores everywhere. When we come back, we'll be rolling out a new feature here on WLIE 540 AM.